Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Apparently, Mike Henderson, the phantom trucker of Interstate 80, had been operating 18-wheelers for more than 15 years when he came across something on the highway that continues to keep him up at night. Mike was transporting a bunch of equipment from Chicago to Sacramento on a chilly February night in 2018. Nebraska's I-80 corridor is infamously barren, particularly in the winter, when snow covers the vast plains and visibility is nearly non-existent. Approximately 11 p.m. when Mike initially arrived, he was roughly 40 miles west of Grand Island, looked in his rearview mirror and saw the headlights. Two well-positioned beams, keeping a precise distance behind his rig, sliced through the whirling snow. He didn't give it much thought at first. Even though many truck drivers travel the same routes, particularly on major interstates, those spotlights never faltered, never drew closer, and never retreated as the miles passed. Mike attempted to communicate over the CB radio. "This is the 80-mile marker, 285 eastbound freight dog, breaker 19, back there. Do you have your ears on?" Just static. He made another attempt, changing the channel, but received no answer. Light to unblinking eyes observing whatever he did, the headlights never changed. Around midnight, Mike anticipated seeing the person who had been after him when he pulled into the Flying J truck stop in Big Springs. After backing into a parking space, he got out of his cab and looked around the lot for the other vehicle. Only a few tractors and a single automobile near the gasoline pumps occupied the almost empty parking lot. He had not been followed in by any truck. Bewildered, Mike circled the parking area, looking in the shadows by the building and behind other trailers. Nothing. Asking the night clerk if he had seen another large rig in behind him, he went inside and got a coffee. The slender, hollow-eyed clerk simply shook his head. "Driver, you are the only truck that has passed by here in the past hour." Mike tried to get rid of the shaky feeling that was crawling up his spine and got back on the road. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Traveling long distances may cause mental confusion, particularly during inclement weather. However, the identical headlights reappeared in his mirrors a few minutes later, staying at the same distance. Mike made the decision to try something new this time. He slowed down from 65 to 55 miles per hour and then to 45 miles per hour. The headlights never closed the distance as they slowed alongside him. They kept up with him exactly as he sped back up to highway speed. The second driver appeared to be following him precisely, as though synchronized with his motions. Mike saw something impossible, and that's when the real dread started. He glimpsed the car behind him and his side mirror bring a brief clearing in the snow. The proportions were off, but it was unquestionably a scimitar. The cab appeared to have been stretched vertically and was too tall and narrow. Additionally, the headlights had an odd blue-white glare because they were elongated, nearly rectangular, rather than spherical like typical truck lights. Mike's hands on the steering wheel began to shake. Although he had seen every vehicle model and make produced in the previous 30 years, this one didn't fit anything he was familiar with. He reached for his phone to snap a photo, but when he held it up to the mirror, the screen behind him displayed nothing but blackness. But the lights were still there when he glanced straight into the mirror. Mike pulled off once more at the next rest stop, this time parking close to other cars and watching to see what would happen. With the engine going, he sat in his cab and looked in his mirrors. Nothing for 10 minutes. Then, as he was ready to turn back onto the highway, the Headlights reappeared at the entrance to the rest area, sitting still as though they had been waiting for him to initiate contact. Mike concluded that he couldn't do this by himself. He explained the situation to his dispatcher and then his wife over the phone. Both advised him to locate a place to spend the night because he was most likely just exhausted, but Mike was aware that this was not paranoia brought on by exhaustion. He was being vigorously stalked across the prairies of Nebraska. He tried everything that came to mind. He took arbitrary detours, doubled back on frontage roads, and even parked in a Walmart parking lot that was open 24 hours a day and circled the structure. Like a predator pacing its prey, those headlights would always resurface, just where they had been previously, keeping that identical following distance. The psychological torment went on for more than 200 meters. Mike began receiving odd signals on his CB radio. There was a low, rhythmic humming that appeared to beat in time with his heartbeat, but no words. Even after turning off the radio, he could still hear the humming, which now appeared to be coming from within his own taxi. The weariness was starting to get to Mike as dawn drew near, and he passed into Colorado. He was beginning to doubt his own sanity as his vision became blurry. Then the headlights came closer, perhaps about Sterling. The ensuing distance was getting shorter for the first time in more than 6 hours. Mike pushed his truck well above the safe speed limit for the icy conditions. By flooring the accelerator, circumstances, he saw the headlights in his mirror continue to gather speed with unfathomable smoothness, as though the pursuing car were not subject to the same physics rules that applied to his own truck. Mike was about to be overcome by the enigmatic light when he topped a hill and was greeted by the sight of a Colorado State Patrol station. With his horn honking, he pulled into the parking lot and dashed inside. At first, the on-duty trooper didn't appear to believe Mike's desperate tale, but he consented to take him back outside to inspect the scene. Mike's truck and 2 cop cars were the only vehicles in the parking lot. The pursuing car was nowhere to be seen. After reviewing Mike's logbooks and running his information, the trooper advised him to rest before continuing his trek. According to the officer, drivers experience highway hypnosis more frequently than you may imagine, particularly during lengthy periods of slack traffic. Mike knew what he had experienced was real, but he made an effort to believe this explanation. He talked to other drivers about odd experiences on I-80 at a truck stop in Denver for the remainder of the day. Many reported seeing strange cars at night, including trucks that appeared and vanished without warning and headlights that didn't work properly. Mike was called aside by a seasoned driver named Carl, who had been operating routes for more than 20 years. Silently, he remarked, "You're not the first to see that thing." Carl clarified that local truckers have formed their own beliefs on the occurrence, saying, "There have been reports going back decades. Some kind of phantom truck that follows drivers across Nebraska. I have never heard of it doing anyone actual harm, but it sure as hell messes with your head." Some thought it was the spirit of a motorist who was destined to always guard the roadway, dying in a blizzard decades ago. Others speculated that it might be an experimental military vehicle being tested on isolated interstate routes. Some even proposed that it might have anything to do with the region's history of cow mutilations and other strange occurrences. Mike made his delivery to Sacramento without any more problems, but the incident still plagued him. He contacted a number of paranormal investigators that focused on highway phenomena and submitted a report to his employer. None of them could adequately explain what he had experienced. Mike kept on traveling in the ensuing months, but he tried to stay off I-80 through Nebraska. He discovered dozens of drivers who had similar stories to tell on online forums, several reports that nearly exactly reflected his experience. The specifics remained constant. The headlights were perfectly aligned. The following behavior was mechanically precise. The CB radio was inoperable, and the enigmatic car could appear and disappear at will. Mike was more troubled by the stalking behavior's deliberate predatory nature than by the encounter's otherworldly elements. Whatever was behind the headlights followed vehicles 4 hours without disclosing its intentions, perhaps enjoying psychological torture. The encounter left him wondering not only what he had witnessed, but also whether the roads he had driven on 4 years might be dangerous in ways that went well beyond the typical risks of bad weather, broken equipment, and human mistake. Even now, when Mike drives at night, he always has additional batteries for his CB radio and makes sure his phone is fully charged. Although he knows other drivers have spotted those recognizable headlights, he has never seen them again. As the next lone driver terrorizes the dark Nebraska plains, the phantom trucker of Interstate 80 keeps up its never-ending patrol. To the rest stop that never closes, after 12 years of transporting freight across the Southwest, Danny Morris came onto the rest stop that shouldn't be there. He was traveling Interstate 20 from Phoenix to Dallas with a shipment of auto parts. In late October 2019, for truckers, the Texas area between Fort Stockton and Odessa is infamous. More than 200 meters of arid desert with limited facilities and few cell towers. Around 2 a.m., D's fuel gauge was perilously near empty, and his bladder was wailing for relief. He had made a rookie error by miscalculating his fuel stops, which could have left him stranded in the midst of nothingness for another 87 miles. The GPS indicated no services. Then he caught sight of it, a blue highway sign that was reflected in his headlights. 2 miles of rest area. Although Danny's memory might be affected by exhaustion, he couldn't recall any rest areas along this section from his prior runs. Reaching the top of a short hill, he saw the familiar structure in front of him, a rectangular structure with restrooms, a few picnic tables, and enough space for a number of large rigs. Above all, he could see the characteristic pumps of a petrol station that was connected to the main building. The rest facility was exceptionally clean for a place so far away. They had just paved the parking lot. The entire structure was illuminated by bright fluorescent lights, giving the impression that it had just been built. Appreciative of the opportunity to stretch his legs and fill up his tank, Danny backed his trailer into a parking space and climbed down. Although the fuel pumps were outdated versions, similar to those found at independent truck stops in rural areas, they functioned perfectly. Danny noticed something strange while filling up his tank. There was no payment terminal or price display on the pump. Presuming there must be an attendant inside, he headed toward the building to pay after he had done filling up. The structure housing the restrooms was immaculate, quite sterile. Everything smelled strongly of industrial disinfectant, and the floors shone in harsh fluorescent illumination. He was most unnerved by the silence, though. There was only the sound of his own footsteps resonating off the tile walls, no distant highway noise, no humming of ventilation systems. After using the facilities, Danny searched for a way to pay for his fuel. There was no cashier window, no attendant booth, and no signage explaining the payment process. He made 2 rounds of the building, looking for signs and phone numbers. He only discovered a small metal inscription that stated, Texas Department of Transportation, EST, 1987. Open 24 hours, close to the door. Danny left a $20 bill weighted down with a rock close to the petrol pumps, since he was confused but didn't want to be accused of fuel theft. He returned to his taxi and continuing east. He forgot about the bizarre incident. He couldn't afford to obsess over small peculiarities because he had a delivery timeline to keep. Danny was jogging the same route 3 weeks later when his fuel condition deteriorated once more in nearly the same location. He remembered the rest area as a handy place to stop for fuel, so this time he was specifically seeking for it. But there was nothing as he got closer to where he was positive it had been. On both sides of the highway, there is nothing but desert scrub terrain. Danny stopped and looked at his logbook and GPS, even used the map software on his phone to search up the place. There were no designated rest areas in the area. The nearest services were more than 80 meters distant, just as he had remembered. He had to nurse his rig to the next truck stop, barely making it on fumes, because he was confused and growing more and more worried about his fuel condition. Danny questioned other motorists at the Flying J in Odessa about rest stops on that section of I-20. A few of seasoned drivers with decades of experience operating Texas routes all gave him the same response. Between Odessa and Fort Stockton, there were no rest stops. It had never been. One driver said, "You might be thinking of the old Texaco station that used to be out there, however, that has been closed for at least 15 years. Following some sort of mishap, the state condemned the property. Danny couldn't get the memory of the rest spot out of his mind that night during his sleeping delivery. Everything was really obvious: the design, the antiseptic restroom building, and the fuel pumps. He had even left money for what he'd pumped in fuel. It hadn't been some delusion brought on by exhaustion. It had been real. Danny couldn't sleep and began looking things up online. He discovered a number of trucker sites where drivers discussed their experiences with enigmatic stops on different highways. His blood ran cold at what he found. Several drivers claimed to have seen the same rest spot he had described, but in various places with the same characteristics each time: the old-fashioned petrol pumps without a payment system, the sterile building, and the total quiet. The posts from cars who have stopped there several times were the most unsettling. With every visit, they spoke of an increasing uneasiness, as though there was something subtle but inexplicable amiss. Some reported discovering personal belongings that didn't belong to them, items that appeared to be from different eras in the restrooms. According to one driver, he saw a 1987 trucker's logbook filled out in handwriting other than his own on a sink counter. Danny came across a 2003 forum post by a driver named Pete Richardson that detailed an experience that was almost exactly like his own. Pete had, over the course of 6 months, we made 3 stops to the enigmatic rest area. Every time, it was in a new state, but it was always along bleak interstate highways. Pete noted that after his 4th visit, he had made the decision to remain longer and take a closer look around the facilities. Pete's posts indicate that he found the buildings inside to be significantly larger than its outside. Other hallways, lined with what appeared to be hotel room doors, extended past the main restroom area. With the exception of one at the far end of the hallway, all of the handles were locked when he tried them. He discovered a little room with a desk, a bed, and personal items that appeared to be decades old, along with clothing, toiletries, and images of individuals dressed in antiquated fashion. Pete made a quick and unsettling last post in the topic. More rooms were found, some of them occupied. Leave this place. Avoid stopping at the hygienic rest area. Simply don't. Pete's account had been inactive for more than 15 years when Danny attempted to reach him via the forum's messaging system. He looked through missing people reports and transportation industry databases for Pete Richardson, but he couldn't find anyone with that name. As the weeks went by, Danny became fixated on mapping out paths that would return him to that section of I-20, though he secretly sensed he was being pulled back to something he didn't comprehend. He told himself it was only curiosity. The recollection persisted in being frustratingly vivid, despite the rational half of his mind insisting that the entire experience had been a stress-induced hallucination. Danny was dead on his way back to Phoenix 2 months after his first encounter, when he purposefully took a detour to travel that particular stretch of highway. He had even allowed his fuel to run low in order to replicate the initial conditions, and it was the same time of night. When he got close to where the rest station had been, his hands were the steering wheel trembling. The rest area was back, just as he had recalled. The ominous silence, the immaculate architecture, and the dazzling lights were all the same. Danny parked this time, but took his time getting out. He studied the facilities through his windshield while he sat in his cab with the motor running. From the arrangement of the picnic tables to the design of the light fixtures, Everything appeared just as it had on his first visit. It was against his better judgment that Danny got out of his taxi. This time, the silence was even more deafening, as though the whole region were isolated from the outside world. His footsteps seemed strangely loud on the tarmac. He moved slowly in the direction of the structure. The bathroom was as pristine and immaculate as he remembered. This time, however, Danny saw nuances that he had previously overlooked. Despite their brilliance, the fluorescent lights did not cast any shadows and did not flicker like regular fixtures. His picture was mirrored in the mirrors over the sinks. However, there was something strange about the mirror, as though he was viewing himself from a little different perspective than he was in reality. Motivated by an inexplicable morbid curiosity, Danny made the decision to venture outside the main restroom area. Partially concealed behind a maintenance panel, he discovered a door he had not previously noticed. As Pete Richardson had said, the door was unlocked and opened onto a long, narrow corridor with numbered doors. With the building's external proportions, the hallway was significantly longer than it should have been. Danny tried door handles as he moved carefully down the hallway. Most were locked, but he could hear rustling, muffled voices, and what sounded like crying coming from behind some of them. Danny's heart stopped as he heard something at door number 23. The distinctive idle sound of a diesel engine pushing his ear against the door. He could hear the steady rumble of a large rig's engine and what sounded like a CV radio crackling with voices in the distance. The door was locked when he tried the handle. However, he could make out flickering light through the keyhole, as though it were coming from a television or screen of a computer. With his head spinning, Danny retreated from the door. How may a truck engine be operating within a structure? The sound was too sharp, too clear, to originate from outside. Confusion and mounting fear froze him as he stood in the corridor, and he became aware that the noises emanating from other rooms were also getting more distinct. He heard what sounded like a man discussing delivery timetables and route planning over the phone from door 19. From the door, the recognizable sound of snoring. Danny began to realize with horror that these were not empty rooms. They were busy, but he couldn't imagine by whom or by what. The structure was unfeasible, existing in an inappropriate location, full of noises that could not be explained rationally. Running back down the hallway, Danny went through the main bathroom and out to his pickup. He could hardly start the engine, since his hands were shaking so much. He noticed the rest area behind him falling into darkness as he moved out of the parking lot, as if the lights were being turned off one room at a time. That was the last time he drove that route. Danny eventually quit long-range trucking entirely and switched to regional runs that put him near big towns. However, when he is unable to sleep at night, he occasionally finds himself looking up other drivers online who may have come across the rest area that pops up and goes away along the most desolate roads in America. Danny discovered that the existence of the location isn't the most unsettling thing. It's the increasing skepticism that some of the drivers who pull over there stay, that those unimaginable spaces become their permanent home. Their voices are added to the symphony of noises that reverberate through unnatural hallways, awaiting the next gullible truck driver to realize that certain rest areas never truly close. 3. The hitchhiker who never left Ray Kowalski, who worked long-distance trucking for 23 years, had one rule: refrain from picking up hitchhikers. Too many drivers had been robbed, beaten, or worse, in his experience. Through misguided pity, they had escorted strangers into their taxis. However, Ray disobeyed his own rule for the first and last time on a rainy night in March 2017 while traveling on Route 119 through the West Virginia highlands. As Ray transported a load of furniture from North Carolina to Pittsburgh, the storm had been intensifying throughout the evening. 11 p.m. He could hardly see the yellow lines because of the bad visibility and the torrential rain. When conditions were favorable, The twisting mountain route was dangerous, but when it was raining, foggy, and had high hills, every mile was a white-knuckle moment. Ree caught a glimpse of her in his headlights at that point. A young woman stands on the shoulder, drenched, frantically calling out for assistance. Wearing trousers and a flimsy jacket that provided no shelter from the rain. She looked to be in her early 20s. In addition to her evident anguish, Ree's position in one of the most isolated and hazardous sections of the Appalachian Highway, at least 50 meters from the closest town, caused her to slow down. Ree halted his vehicle and lowered his passenger window, with water dripping from her clothing and her long, dark hair matted to her face. The woman walked up to the taxi. Her voice could almost be heard over the storm as she called up to him, "Please. I was almost 2 miles back when my automobile broke down. I've spent hours strolling. All I have to do is make it to the next town." Ree found himself unlocking the passenger door against his better judgment, yelling at him to get out of the car. The fragrance of rain and something else accompanied the woman as she hopped into the taxi, something cloying and delicious that reminded Ree of flowers in a vase that had been left out too long. Without a word, she sat down in the passenger seat and closed the door. "Thank you so much," she replied in a quiet, oddly melodious voice. "I didn't anticipate anyone stopping." Ree noticed her skin was very pale, almost translucent in the dim light of the cab. When he turned to face her, she had black eyes. He couldn't see the pupils because it was so black. Additionally, her teeth appeared abnormally white when she smiled. "No problem," Ree said, although he was already feeling guilty about his choice. "What's your name?" "I'm Ree, Sarah," she answered. But something about the way she said it made Ree think she'd hesitated, as if she'd had to remember the name. "I'm Sarah." Ree resumed driving up the mountain road after shifting the truck back into drive. As they drove, Ree tried to strike up a conversation, but Sarah's answers were few and odd. When he asked where she was from, she replied, "Around here." Sarah sat quietly next to him, staring straight ahead through the windshield, and despite being completely soaked, she didn't shiver, and Ree noticed that the cab's temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees since she'd gotten in. Ree turned up the heat, but the chill persisted, but was unable to identify a particular town. When he said her automobile broke, the most disturbing thing was the way she stared at him when she thought he was not looking. Not with gratitude or the usual human curiosity, but with an intensity that made his skin crawl. After about half an hour, Ree noticed something that made his blood run cold. Despite the heavy rain and humid conditions, the windows surrounding Sarah weren't fogging up from her breath. In fact, he couldn't see any condensation from her breathing at all. He looked over at her chest and realized with increasing horror that he couldn't see any condensation from her breathing. Ree's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as panic took hold. He tried to explain what he was seeing, thinking that perhaps she was simply breathing shallowly, or that the strange lighting in the cab was just playing tricks on his eyes. But he knew deep down that something was seriously wrong with his passenger. "So Sarah," Ree said, trying to keep his voice steady, "what do you do for a living?" The temperature in the cab dropped even more, and Ree could now see his own breath misting in the air. Sarah turned to face him with those unnaturally dark eyes, and her voice seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat. "I wait," she said simply, "for people like you." Despite the heater running at full blast, ice started to form on the inside corners of the windshield, and Sarah's wet clothes should have been steaming in the cab. The next town was still 20 meters away, but Ree remembered passing a 24-hour gas station about 5 miles back down the mountain, so he would turn around, take her there, and let someone else handle whatever was going on. You know what? A warm cab. But instead they seemed to be drying without producing any visible vapor. "I just remembered I need to fuel up," Ree remarked, attempting to sound informal. "A station can be found further down the road. I'm sure someone will be there when I drop you off. Can assist you in traveling to town." Like an owl turning its neck, Sarah's head turned toward him in an oddly fluid motion. "No," she answered, and her tone had completely changed. Now it was deeper, multiplied, as though multiple voices were speaking simultaneously. Ray's foot uncontrollably pushed further on the accelerator, saying, "We're not going back." In order to see bright lights and other people, he wanted to reach the next town as soon as possible. Ray felt the truck slowing down, even though he had his foot on the gas pedal. But Sarah put one hand on the dashboard as his speed rose. Even though the engine was still running, the car seemed to be being held back by an unseen force. "What are you?" Ray muttered, losing the ability to pretend that this was an ordinary occurrence. When Sarah smiled, Ray noticed that her teeth were all black instead of white, as if she had coal in her mouth. In her amplified voice, she asked, What happens when people don't follow their instincts?" Ray tried desperately to speed up, but the truck had now slowed to a crawl. He could see through the rain-streaked glass that the road ahead appeared to be going on forever, as though the distance to the next town was getting farther away every second. There were none of the familiar sights he had seen dozens of times along this road. Reaching for his CB radio, Ray hastily changed channels and called for assistance. "Mayday, mayday. This is a Route 119 freight dog. Milestone, milestone." The numbers on the mile markers they were passing didn't make sense to him. Some showed symbols he didn't identify, some were counting backwards, and some were repeating. The radio was packed with static, but Ray could hear something that almost stopped his heart beneath the white noise. There were dozens of voices, all wailing in fear and despair. They were the cries for assistance that would never come from other drivers who had made the same error as him. Sarah had turned away from Ray. Rather, she was gazing at something in the shadows beyond the tree line through the passenger window. Ray followed her eyes and noticed that the woodland was filled with lights. It was a cold, pale light that seemed to dance amongst the trees like will-o'-the-wisps, not the headlights of cars or spotlights. Sarah said, "They're waiting," in a voice that was hardly human anymore. Ray became increasingly horrified upon realizing that he had lost control of his truck. "They've been waiting so long," he said. Under his hands, the steering wheel twisted, leading the large rig along a dirt route he had never seen before. Even though this route had been traveled innumerable times, the headlights revealed a narrow trail that meandered deeper into the mountains, with dense, tall trees on either side, that barred out of the cloudy sky what little light there was. Ray started to see more cars as they continued to drive through the woodland. Automobiles, trucks, and motorcycles in varying degrees of disrepair. With their corroded metal frames covered with moss and vines, several appeared to have been there for decades. Others seemed newer, but they were all deserted, their doors dangling open as though their occupants had just disappeared. There was a clearing at the end of the dirt road, and hundreds of cars made a rough circle around what appeared to be an abandoned mining facility. Corroded machinery and a labyrinth of shadows and twisted metal was formed by abandoned buildings, and there were figures among the ruins, those who, like Ray, had been drivers, but now stood still and still, their eyes reflecting the dim light coming from somewhere farther down the mine. Ray didn't have to apply the brakes for his pickup to stop. He noticed that Sarah's face was changing, growing less human by the moment, as she turned to face him one last time. As though her appearance had never been established in the first place, her features were dissolving and regenerating. The voice she used to say, "Thank you for the ride," was now wholly unnatural. A wind-like roar across deserted caverns. Ray wanted to say, "You can leave now," wished to turn on the car and go, but his hands moved without his awareness. Even though his mind cried out in protest, he opened the driver's door and got out of the cab, using his legs to propel himself forward. With blank expressions and strangely synchronized movements, the other people in the clearing turned to watch him approach. Ray could hear the motor of his truck revving up behind him. He made his way to the underground entrance. By the time he looked around, Sarah was behind the wheel, effortlessly adjusting the mirrors. Before shifting into gear and heading back toward the main road, she gave him a small wave. She was probably waiting for the next trucker, who would be stupid enough to pick up a hitchhiker on a stormy, dark night. Ray attempted to scream and to flee, but his body was no longer his. Along with the dozens of other drivers who had disregarded their own rules and suffered the consequences, he became one of the silent figures. While Sarah continues her never-ending search throughout West Virginia's mountain roads, he waits motionless, in the clearing, keeping an eye out for newcomers. The odd thing is that 3 days later, Ray's truck was discovered abandoned at a rest area south of Charleston. The keys were still in the ignition, the load was undamaged, and there was no indication of the driver's condition, according to the official report. It was a voluntary abandonment, just another truck driver who had left his duties without giving a reason. However, other Route 119 drivers are more knowledgeable. During storms, they have witnessed the young lady standing on the side of the road, frantically seeking a ride. No matter how much she cries out for assistance or waves, they've learned to keep their doors shut and their eyes on the road. Because some people who hitchhike are seeking more than just a ride. Additionally, some rides come to a conclusion at locations that aren't shown on maps, for that measures more than cargo. When Tom Bradley came upon the wait station, that permanently altered his perception of what government facilities truly measure. He was transporting a standard load of construction equipment from Kansas City to Denver. In the middle of October 2020, Tom had been operating a commercial vehicle for 8 years without one infraction or citation. He took great satisfaction in keeping his loads within the permitted weight ranges and in maintaining his equipment in pristine condition. Tom was familiar with the section of Interstate 70 that was across eastern Colorado when the event happened. Approximately 3 in the morning, he noticed the recognizable blue signs pointing to a required way station up ahead as he drove through the pre-dawn darkness. Although he didn't recall the specific station from earlier runs, there were periodically new facilities constructed, and the signage was appropriately dock-compliant, clean, reflective, and professional. Tom followed the truck lane, which was plainly marked, and pulled into the way station. With several scales and a central office building that was well lit despite the early hour, the facility appeared contemporary and well maintained. He found it odd that there were no other trucks at all. Even in the middle of the night, there was at least some traffic at the majority of required stations. However, this location was hauntingly empty. Tom was guided to scale number 3 by the computerized signs. He saw that the scale itself appeared to be different from others he had used when he set up his rig on the platform. This platform, rather than being made of the usual concrete and steel, had an odd, almost organic texture, with surfaces that seemed to pulse slightly under the weight of his truck. The feeling was so subtle that at first Tom thought it was exhaustion, deceiving his senses. Less than a minute should have passed during the weighing process, yet the computer display kept cycling through illogical numbers, rather than displaying the real weight of his truck, which was around 78,000 pounds. The readout showed numbers like 156,847 pounds, 23,192 pounds, 12.3 pounds, and ultimately almost 400,000 pounds. It was the most dramatic malfunction Tom had ever witnessed on a scale. Over the intercom, a voice crackled, "Driver, please come into the office so we can check you." The tone of the voice made Tom's skin crawl, even if it was distorted by static, as though the person speaking was meticulously pronouncing each word in accordance with a script they had learned, but didn't completely comprehend. It seemed too professional and exact. Tom got out of his taxi and headed for the office complex. As he approached, the more he saw certain aspects that didn't quite go together. The building's architecture was typical government, but there were no obvious agency insignia or identifying numbers that ought to have been clearly evident, and the windows were so darkly tinted that he couldn't see inside. Fluorescent lights Inside the office was sharply lighted and buzzed with an electrical hum that was louder than usual. A man wearing what looked to be a dot outfit sat behind a counter, yet the uniform was somehow incorrect. The hues seemed a little strange, the fabric had an artificial gloss, and the patches were not in the proper places. The individual at first sight, the official appeared normal, but upon closer inspection, Tom saw that his skin had a waxy, manufactured quality akin to that of a department store mannequin. In that same overly exacting voice Tom had heard on the intercom, the official said, "License and registration, please." The official's movements were stiff and mechanical when Tom handed over his documents, as if he was controlling his own body with conscious effort instead of instinctive reactions. The official looked at Tom's paperwork with unusual intensity, holding each document abnormally close to his face, his eyes not moving back and forth like a reader's. The official said, "Your load appears to be overweight," but Tom knew this was impossible because he had weighed the trailer at the origin point and had been well within legal limits. "We'll need to conduct a more thorough inspection." Instead, they stayed fixed in one place while he held the papers at different angles, as if he were scanning them with some sort of internal sensor rather than actually reading the text. The official led Tom to a bay area behind the main building where his truck had somehow been moved without him hearing the engine start or seeing anyone drive it. This was the first time Tom had ever truly become alarmed. When he told the official that he had keys with him and the truck had been locked, the official only gave him that look and said again, "We'll need to do a more complete check." Tom had never seen an inspection area like this at other way stations. Instead of the usual concrete floor and simple tools, this bay had complex machinery that hummed and made electronic noises, cables and sensors attached to different parts of his trailer, and monitors showing readings that were made up of numbers and symbols Tom didn't recognize. What followed was completely illogical. He clarified that the official had instructed Tom to stand on a small platform next to his truck for calibration purposes, and that as soon as he stepped onto the platform, all of the facility's screens started to display rapidly changing numbers but not weight measurements that seemed to be biological data, including body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, and other metrics that no truckway station had any reason to keep an eye on. When Tom attempted to leave the platform, he discovered that his feet appeared to be stuck to its surface, not physically attached, but held by some sort of magnetic or electrical force that stopped him from raising his legs, and he became panicked when he realized he was stuck on the platform, and the official was staring at him with a look that no longer tried to be human, and the readings on the monitors grew more unsettling. On one screen, Tom could see displays that tracked what seemed to be his emotional state, stress levels, and something called cognitive resonance that changed as his fear grew, while on another, anatomical diagrams rotated and zoomed in on various parts of his body, highlighting organs and systems in ways that suggested a medical examination far more thorough than any external scan could provide. "This specimen shows optimal parameters for processing," the official said. Excellent readings, but his tone had changed, no longer modulated, and instead sounded like multiple voices speaking simultaneously, as if multiple people were trying to use the same vocal cords. Tom's fear reached a peak when he noticed that other figures had entered the inspection bay. More officials in the same wrong uniforms, all moving with the same mechanical precision, surrounded his truck and started connecting additional equipment. "That this will just take a moment," one of the figures said in that multi-layered voice, "because we need samples for proper cataloging." The devices, which looked more like medical equipment or laboratory instruments with tubes, needles, and collection chambers that made no sense in the context of a truck inspection, were clearly not standard dot inspection gear. The officials ignored his grief and carried on with their preparations with mechanical efficiency, but Tom found his voice and started yelling for help, but his cries seemed to be absorbed by the building itself, producing no echo or reverberation. When the lights went out, the humming stopped, and Tom found he could move his feet again. He heard the officials talking to each other in voices that no longer tried to sound human, a rapid chittering, and the needle was inches from Tom's arm. When all the equipment suddenly shut down simultaneously, Tom could see his reflection in the polished surfaces of the bay, but what scared him the most was that the officials cast no reflections at all, leaving only Tom and his truck visible in the mirrors and chrome surfaces, as if the uniformed figures weren't physically there. Tom didn't wait to learn what had happened or why he had been released. He drove out of the inspection bay and back onto the highway as fast as he could manage, not stopping until he reached a familiar truck stop 30 miles down the road. At the truck stop, Tom immediately called the Colorado Department of Transportation to report the incident. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in a red glow. Tom ran toward his truck, expecting to find it disabled or damaged, but the engine started immediately. The DOT dispatcher conducted a comprehensive check of all facilities along that stretch of I-70 and confirmed that there was no way station, mandatory or otherwise, at the mile marker Tom specified. Tom insisted he had the location correct and even provided the exact mile marker where he had exited the highway, but official records showed there was no mandatory way station at that mile marker, and the closest inspection facility was more than 100 meters away, and it hadn't been operational for mandatory inspections in more than 2 years due to budget cuts. Disturbed by the disparity, Tom drove back to the site the following day with another driver as a witness, and they discovered nothing but empty prairie land on both sides of the highway. No buildings, no scales, no access roads, just the natural Colorado landscape that had existed there for thousands of years. What was even more disturbing was the lack of any indication that any construction had ever taken place there. The state had never operated an inspection facility there, and no permits had been issued for any private company to construct such a facility. The official report classified the incident as driver fatigue hallucination, a relatively common occurrence among long-haul truckers, but Tom knew what he had experienced was real because it was documented in his logbook. Tom reported the incident to the state police, who conducted their own investigation. Officers found no evidence of any structures at the specified location, no reports of similar incidents from other drivers, and no explanation for what Tom claimed to have experienced. There were no concrete foundations, no electrical connections, and no disturbance of the soil that would indicate recent building activity, where the truck's GPS system indicated a stationary period at that mile marker, even though there was supposedly nothing there for him to have stopped at, and where the electronic monitoring system had recorded a 2-hour gap in his driving time at the exact location he'd described. What was more unsettling were the medical tests Tom had to undergo at his own expense a week after the incident. MRI scans revealed microscopic metallic objects in his bloodstream that hadn't been there during his last physical 6 months prior, and when Tom attempted to have the metallic objects analyzed, they mysteriously vanished from the lab samples before testing could be completed. For several more months, Tom drove, but he stayed away from that section of I-7 whenever he could. Other drivers he talked to described strange experiences at what they believed to be proper way stations, facilities that didn't show up on official maps, inspections that involved equipment unrelated to trucking, and officials whose actions seemed somehow inhuman. The most terrifying revelation came when Tom joined a commercial drivers online forum and discovered dozens of similar stories. Drivers nationwide reported encounters with mysterious inspection facilities that appeared and vanished. Tom eventually quit long-haul trucking and accepted a local delivery job that kept him within 50 miles of his home base, but he never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened at the weight station that didn't exist. He discovered that some government facilities measure more than just the weight of your cargo. They measure things about the drivers themselves that no legitimate agency has any business collecting. The most unsettling realization is that these encounters are still occurring somewhere on America's highways, under the guise of routine regulatory stops. 5. The convoy that never stopped. In late November 2019, Marcus Rivera was dead, traveling from Detroit to Oklahoma City with an empty trailer, when he encountered what at first glance appeared to be the camaraderie that makes long-haul trucking bearable during the most lonely hours. The convoy changed his understanding of what happens to truckers who disappear without a trace, leaving the drivers who encounter them with more questions than answers, and sometimes with changes to their own bodies that they never consented to and cannot explain. Convoy forming up for the Southern Run on Interstate 65 through Indiana. Marcus was fighting fatigue and thinking about stopping for a few hours of sleep when he noticed headlights approaching quickly in his mirrors. As the car got closer, he saw that it was another large rig, followed by 2 more trucks, all in perfect formation. The lead truck pulled alongside Marcus and the driver motioned for him to roll down his window. The other driver, who looked to be in his 50s and was dressed in a flannel shirt and baseball cap, as is customary for seasoned drivers, called across the space between their cabs. Got room for one more, if it would be safer to run in a convoy as the 4th truck in the line, heading toward Oklahoma. The lead driver identified himself over the CB's Iron Horse, followed by Mudflap and Diesel Dad. Marcus used his handle Desert Fox and got into the rhythm of the convoy. He knew that the stretch of highway ahead had several active construction areas with narrow lanes and reduced speed limits, and that having other drivers around would help him stay alert. The CB chatter was standard trucker conversation, weather, road reports, and friendly banter between the drivers, but as the hours went by, Marcus noticed subtle oddities in their communication. The formation was remarkably tight and professional, with each truck maintaining perfect spacing and lane changes executed with military precision. These were obviously experienced drivers who had worked together before. As they rolled through the Indiana countryside, despite using different handles, they all responded in unison when acknowledging road conditions, and none of them seemed to have different personalities. At 4 a.m., Marcus realized that they had been driving for more than 2 hours without any of the other trucks stopping for a fuel, restroom breaks, or the required rest periods required by federal regulations. Iron Horse's response was prompt and in sync with the others when he mentioned that he needed to stop at the next truck stop. The first indication of serious trouble was when Marcus tried to leave the convoy at a truck stop near Indianapolis, and as he indicated that he intended to pull off at the next ramp, he discovered that his steering wheel was getting harder to turn, which wasn't a mechanical issue with his truck. We maintained formation until destination. Marcus tried to explain that he was legally required to take breaks according to his logbook, but the other drivers simply repeated the same phrase in unison. What was more unsettling was the fact that their voices were becoming more and more alike over the radio, as if the 3 different personalities he'd heard earlier were blending into a single entity, speaking with multiple mouths. When he tried to reduce his speed to fall behind the convoy, his accelerator pedal became unresponsive, and the truck maintained its exact speed and position regardless of his inputs. When he tried to use his Jake brake to slow down, nothing happened. The truck continued rolling forward at precisely the same speed as the others, maintaining that perfect formation spacing, as if all 4 vehicles were connected by invisible cables. The power steering was functioning perfectly for normal driving, but whenever he tried to steer away from the convoy formation, the wheel would resist, as if some unseen force was keeping him in line with the other vehicles. Panic struck when Marcus realized he was no longer in control of his own truck, and he tried the CB radio once more. The 3 trucks in his convoy responded in perfect unison, saying, "Desert Fox, you are exactly where you need to be. Maintain formation. Destination approaching." This time, he called for emergency assistance on Channel 19. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Desert Fox on I-65 northbound, mile marker 127. I've lost control of my vehicle and need immediate assistance. While in an area with normally excellent coverage, Marcus grabbed his cell phone to call 911, but the screen showed no signal. When he tried his truck's satellite communication system, it displayed an error message he had never seen before: communication restricted during convoy operations. As dawn drew near, Marcus realized they were no longer traveling the route he had anticipated. Instead, the convoy had somehow shifted onto roads that didn't appear on his GPS, and the scenery outside looked incorrect. When Marcus looked closely at the other trucks in his convoy, he realized that what he had initially assumed to be normal road wear and weather damage was actually something far more disturbing. The trailers had rust patterns that looked almost organic, spreading across the metal surfaces like veins or root systems, and the paint on the cabs was faded in ways that suggested decades of use. The few buildings they passed looked abandoned, their windows dark, and their parking lots empty of any vehicles, except for the occasional big rigs sitting motionless and apparently deserted. The convoy pulled into what looked like a huge truck stop at noon, though Marcus Watch had stopped working hours earlier. This facility was unlike any Marcus had ever seen, as the parking lot stretched 4 miles in all directions, with hundreds of large rigs arranged in perfect rows, and none of the trucks showed any signs of recent activity, including drivers walking around, engines running, or lights in any of the sleeper cabs. The building at the center of this enormous parking area was enormous, easily the size of several aircraft hangars. The building's architecture was off in some way, with angles that seemed to bend in directions that were painful to look at directly, and it looked like it was made of the same materials as truck trailers, but it had been weathered and corroded until it looked almost biological. Marcus' truck pulled to a stop in a designated parking spot, the engine cutting off on its own even though he still had the key, and the doors unlocked with a mechanical click that sounded odd in the sudden silence outside. The other drivers in his convoy were descending from their cabs with the same coordinated precision they'd maintained on the road. Iron Horse said, "Welcome to your destination," but now his voice came from all 3 drivers at once, and when Marcus looked closely, he saw that their faces were the same, as if they were 3 copies of the same person, and that their eyes reflected light, like reflective road signs instead of human pupils. Marcus tried to start his truck and go, but the engine wouldn't start, and he tried to use his radio to call for help, but every channel produced the same result, that synchronized voice informing him that he was exactly where he needed to be. Marcus became aware of the terrible reality when he saw his own reflection in his truck's mirror. His face was starting to change, becoming the same weathered appearance as the other drivers. His clothes were fading to match the generic trucker uniform that everyone else in the facility wore, and most unsettling of all, when he tried to speak, his voice was beginning to synchronize with the others, losing its individual characteristics and blending into the collective sound that echoed across the endless parking lot. He was becoming part of the convoy, losing his unique identity. Marcus's last clear thought as an individual was that this was what happened to the truckers, who vanished, the ones whose abandoned rigs were found at rest stops with no trace of their drivers, the ones whose families never received answers about where they'd gone, the ones whose memories of life before the convoy were already becoming hazy, replaced by an overwhelming compulsion to return to the roads and find other drivers to recruit into their endless formation. They had been recruited into a convoy that traveled roads that were not on any map, bringing in more drivers to join their coordinated formation until they had enough members to set up new recruiting posts. Marcus became one of the identical figures standing next to their trucks, waiting for the next phase of operations. Before long, the convoy would disperse and return to the regular highways, with each driver looking for lone truckers who might be persuaded to join their formation. The cycle would continue, adding more drivers one by one, until every truck on America's highways was a part of their coordinated network. Other drivers occasionally report seeing impossibly long convoys on remote stretches of highway, formations of trucks that once had a name, a family, and an individual identity, but now serve a collective purpose that transcends human understanding, maintaining perfect formation as they travel between the world of normal trucking and the realm where all convoys eventually converge. The facility exists beyond normal geography, accessible only through specific routes that appear when the convoy needs new members. The trucks parked there represent decades of recruitment. As the convoy continues its work, patrolling America's highways in smaller formations, always ready to offer the safety and camaraderie that lone drivers crave during their most lonely hours, and in truck stops across the nation, families continue to wait for drivers who will never come home, their loved ones having joined a convoy that never stops rolling, never reaches its final destination, and never releases the drivers who become part of its fleet. These observers, who seem to be watching some sort of military or commercial operation, never realizing they're looking at the recruitment wing of something far more sinister. 6. The load that couldn't be delivered. In his 11 years as an owner-operator, Jake Morrison had hauled everything from furniture to livestock. But this load, which he picked up in Portland on a foggy October morning in 2021, would be his last. At 3 a.m., his broker had sent him a dispatch regarding an urgent delivery from Oregon to a small town in Montana with an irresistible premium rate. The cargo was listed as medical supplies with special handling instructions, and the shipper was prepared to pay double the usual rate for expedited transportation. Just after dawn, Jake arrived at the pickup location, which was in an industrial area he had never worked in before, housed in a nondescript warehouse with no company signage or identification. Two men in coveralls, who spoke very little English and appeared nervous about something, were in charge of the loading dock and told Jake to back up to Bay 7 so that their personnel could load his trailer. The loading process took much longer than usual for what should have been a simple pickup, and Jake waited in his cab for more than 3 hours while the warehouse crew loaded his trailer. As the loading was finally finished, the warehouse foreman gave Jake a sealed envelope with the delivery paperwork. "Don't open this until you reach the destination," the man said in heavily accented English. "Very important you follow route exactly as written. No stops except for fuel." He also noticed a few strange details during that time. The workers wore full hazmat suits despite the cargo allegedly being routine medical supplies, and they used equipment more suited for handling hazardous materials than standard freight. The first indication that something was amiss came about 50 miles outside Portland. Jake signed the bills of loading without carefully reading them, a mistake he would regret for the rest of his brief life. The paperwork listed a delivery address in a town called Millfield, Montana, with GPS coordinates that put it somewhere the far northern part of the state. The cargo was described only as biological research materials with handling codes Jake didn't recognize. He thought it was just roadside vegetation, or maybe a chemical plant he was passing. But the smell persisted and gradually got stronger until it was nauseating. Jake tried shutting off his vents and switching to recirculated air, but it seemed to be coming from inside his own truck. Worse, he was starting to hear sounds from his trailer, not the typical shifting and settling of cargo, but rhythmic tapping. He started to smell something through the ventilation system of his cab, a sweet, cloying smell that reminded him of flowers mixed with something medicinal, and scratching that indicated something alive was moving around back there. Jake pulled into a truck stop near Coeur d'Alene with the intention of inspecting his trailer, despite the shipper's instructions. But upon walking to the back of his rig, he discovered that the trailer doors had been sealed with an industrial adhesive that had solidified into an impenetrable barrier, and the entire rear of the trailer was covered in a substance that resembled hardened resin, making it impossible to open the doors without specialized equipment. What Jake noticed about the trailer itself was even more unsettling. The aluminum sides were starting to show dark stains that appeared to be spreading from the inside out, as if something in the cargo was leaking through the metal walls. When Jake tried to call the broker who had arranged the load, the phone number went to a disconnected voicemail. When he called the shipping company, in it on the paperwork, directory assistants informed him that there was no such business. And even more concerning, when he looked up the delivery address online, he found no record of a town called Millfield anywhere in Montana. The stains had an organic appearance, like blood stains or some other bodily fluid, and they pulsed with a subtle rhythm that reminded Jake of a heartbeat. The sounds from his trailer became more noticeable as Jake drove through the night into Montana. What had begun as occasional tapping and scratching turned into a constant rustling and movement that suggested multiple sources of activity. Perhaps the cargo contained some kind of preservative chemicals that explained the smell, and the sealed doors were just an extra security measure for valuable medical research. He convinced himself that the strange circumstances had reasonable explanations, and that abandoning freight would result in serious financial and legal consequences. Around 3 a.m., Jake's truck's satellite communication system lost signal. His cell phone showed no service, and even his CB radio picked up nothing but static. Gelatinous was moving around inside the trailer. The GPS coordinates led Jake onto increasingly remote roads as he approached the supposed delivery location. The highways gave way to state routes, then county roads, and finally to unmarked dirt tracks that seemed to lead deeper into uninhabited wilderness. The delivery address led Jake to a large building at the end of the main street, which looked like a cross between a medical facility and a warehouse with loading docks. Jake's headlights illuminated a sign that should have been impossible. Welcome to Millfield, Montana. Population 847. The town emerged from the darkness like a movie set, with a main street lined by buildings that looked decades old, but were in perfect condition. Street lamps cast circles of yellow light, but Jake saw no people, no other vehicles, and no signs of normal activity. Docks and what looked like laboratory equipment were visible through large windows. Floodlights came on automatically as Jake backed his trailer up to the designated bay, illuminating the area with harsh white light. 3 figures, wearing full body protective suits similar to what Jake had seen at the pickup location, came out of the building to oversee the unloading. Their movements were somehow incorrect, too coordinated and fluid, as if they were walking in a choreographed dance, and when they spoke to one another, Jake could hear their voices through his open window, but the language was not English or any other human language he recognized. The unloading process started right away, with the suited figures using specialized equipment to cut through the hardened sealant on Jake's trailer doors. The smell that had been bothering Jake all the way rose to an almost intolerable level as soon as the doors opened. But even worse than the odor was what he saw when he looked inside his trailer before the figures blocked his view. Instead of medical supplies or research materials, the cargo looked like large translucent containers filled with some sort of biological material suspended in viscous fluid. The containers pulsed with internal light, and the contents moved with an unsettling organic motion that suggested life forms Jake had never seen before. Some of the containers had cracked during transportation. Their contents spilled onto the trailer floor, where the fluid had started to eat through the metal. As the suited figures unloaded the containers, Jake became increasingly horrified to see that some of the biological material was reacting to his presence. The contents of multiple containers pressed against their walls, leaving behind impressions that resembled faces, with human faces contorted in expressions of terror or agony. The fluid surrounding these impressions took on a reddish hue that made Jake think of blood. Jake attempted to start his truck and drive away, but the engine refused to start. He glanced at his instrument panel, all the gauges spinning wildly, warning lights flashing in patterns that matched the pulsing rhythm he'd been hearing from his trailer, as if his truck had been infected by whatever he'd been hauling. Its mechanical systems compromised by exposure to the biological cargo. One of the suited figures came up to Jake's cab and motioned for him to roll down his window. And when Jake did so, the figure spoke in perfect English, but with an electronic tone that suggested it was being produced artificially. "Thank you for finishing this delivery. Your services are no longer needed." After feeling a sharp pain in his neck, Jake looked down to see that the figure had used a device that looked more like a medical instrument than a weapon to inject him with something. The injection site immediately started to burn, and Jake could feel whatever had been injected spreading through his bloodstream at liquid fire. As the drug took effect, Jake's vision became blurry and his thoughts became more disjointed, and he saw more figures emerge from buildings throughout the town, all of them wearing the same protective suits, moving with the same strange coordination, indicating that Millfield wasn't a real town at all, but rather a facility masquerading as a rural community. The biological material he had been transporting had not only been cargo, but had also been spreading throughout his truck and into his own body during the lengthy journey from Oregon. 3 days later, Jake's truck was discovered abandoned at a rest stop outside Billings, Montana. The trailer was empty and had been thoroughly cleaned with industrial solvents, leaving no trace of whatever cargo it had contained. His family and law enforcement searched his truck extensively, but they were unable to locate Jake himself. Jake was an experienced driver with no history of mental health issues, so it made no economic sense to abandon a valuable truck. But other truckers who knew Jake refused to accept the conclusion that he had likely suffered some sort of medical emergency or psychological breakdown, abandoned his truck, and wandered into the wilderness where he died of exposure. What was more troubling were the reports from other drivers who claimed to have received similar loads from the same mysterious broker. A number of them reported picking up medical supplies from unmarked warehouses, hauling sealed trailers to remote locations, and experiencing strange symptoms during transport. Most of these drivers completed their deliveries without incident, but a few just vanished, and their trucks were found. No official maps or census records show the town of Millfield, Montana, and the GPS coordinates Jake followed lead to an area of uninhabited wilderness with no roads or structures, but truckers continue to report receiving deliveries to this non-existent location, and some accept the loads, despite the premium rates and unusual circumstances. Jake's truck was eventually sold at auction, but its new owner reported mechanical problems that defied diagnosis. The vehicle's systems would occasionally malfunction in ways that seemed almost organic, and a persistent odor in the cab couldn't be eliminated despite professional cleaning. The truck was scrapped after a few months, its parts strewn to salvage yards across the nation. And the most terrifying part of Jake's disappearance is the possibility that he wasn't killed by whatever was in his trailer, but instead became part of it, that the biological materials he carried were made to blend with their host, turning human tissue into something that benefits whoever runs the facility under the guise of Millfield, Montana, and that loads are still offered for transport to places that don't exist, carrying cargo that changes the vehicles and the drivers who transport it. The mirror that showed too much in remote places masquerading as small towns. Facilities carry on with their work, processing deliveries from all over the nation and transforming their contents into forms that can integrate with human biology in ways that science hasn't yet discovered. Kevin Walsh had been driving the same 2018 Peterbilt for 4 years when he replaced the driver's side mirror following a minor collision at a truck stop in Memphis. The replacement mirror was taken from a salvage yard in Arkansas that had been pulled from a rig that had been totaled in what the yard owner described as a real strange wreck, and Kevin didn't give the mirror's history much thought. In order to get back on the road with a load headed for Seattle, he simply needed a quick, inexpensive replacement. The mirror had the same mounting hardware and adjustment mechanisms as his original equipment, and Kevin installed it himself in the parking lot of the salvage yard, adjusted the angle for proper visibility, and was back on Interstate 40 within an hour, about 50 miles west of Memphis. Kevin noticed movement in the new mirror that didn't correspond to anything happening on the road behind him. At first, he thought the strange reflections were due to exhaustion, as he had been driving for 12 hours straight and was exceeding his allotted driving time. However, as night fell and traffic subsided, the images in the mirror became unavoidable. Instead of the deserted highway behind his trailer, the mirror showed what appeared to be other cars, trucks, motorcycles, and other vehicles that weren't actually there when Kevin looked directly behind him or checked his other mirrors. The phantom vehicles in the mirror moved according to their own logic, separate from the actual traffic surrounding Kevin's truck. Occasionally, he would see a convoy of old trucks following closely behind him, their headlights creating a procession that extended back beyond the mirror's field of vision. Other times, the mirror showed contemporary cars driving erratically, swerving between lanes, and the mirror looked perfectly normal under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot, just standard glass in a regulation housing. But when Kevin looked into it from his driver's seat, he could see the phantom traffic continuing to move behind him. If the mirror was showing a different highway entirely, one that existed parallel to the real Interstate 40, but followed different rules. The most unsettling thing was that some of the vehicles in the mirror appeared to be decades old. Kevin pulled into a truck stop near Little Rock to examine the mirror more closely. As Kevin continued west through Arkansas and into Oklahoma, he started to notice patterns in the phantom traffic. Some vehicles appeared repeatedly, always in the same relative positions, as if they were following predetermined routes. One truck, in particular, a faded blue Kenworth with distinctive chrome exhaust stacks, appeared in his mirror every time Kevin checked it. But they were clearly from different eras, even though they were perfectly maintained. Some of the cars looked even older, with styling from the 1950s and 1960s, but they moved alongside modern vehicles in a traffic pattern that defied chronological logic. The blue Kenworth became Kevin's unintentional obsession, and he began timing its appearances and attempting to interact with it by altering his driving patterns. Even though his other mirrors showed nothing but empty highway, the blue truck would shift position to maintain its relative location behind him when he changed lanes, slowed down proportionately when Kevin slowed down, and matched his speed exactly when he accelerated, to see if the phantom traffic could see him as clearly as he could see them. Kevin flashed his brake lights in a pattern 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the universal SOS signal that any trucker would recognize around midnight somewhere in the Oklahoma panhandle. The blue Kenworth responded instantly and terrifyingly, flashing back the same pattern with its headlights, followed by a series of fast blinks that appeared almost frantic. Breaker warning. This is Highway Ghost eastbound on the 40-mile marker 23. Blue Kenworth behind me. You got your ears on. Kevin reached for his CB radio and attempted to contact him. The response came not from his radio speakers, but from a voice that seemed to come from the mirror itself. Highway Ghost. This is Phantom Rider. I've been trying to get in touch with you for 30 years. You got the mirror. You can see us now. We've been waiting for someone who could see. Kevin's hands trembled on the steering wheel as the voice in his cab went on. That mirror came from my truck. Wrecked it back in '92, trying to get away from what I was seeing. Didn't you? We're all here. Everyone who's seen it. Driving the highway that runs alongside yours. Work. Once you see the other road, you can't unsee it. The realization struck Kevin like a blow to the body. The phantom cars and trucks in his mirror weren't just any traffic. They were people who had somehow found themselves stuck on a different version of the American highway system, a system of parallel roads that ran concurrently with the actual highways, but were subject to alternative time and physics principles. How can I remove the mirror? You can't. Once you're connected, you're part of the network. The only way off is to bring your truck across to our side, Kevin said, addressing his mirror directly. The answer came from a variety of voices, as though every motorist on the Phantom Highway was speaking at once. When he uncovered the mirror, he could see the driver, a man in his 50s, wearing a trucker cap, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion, that looked decades old. The Phantom driver was making the urgent gestures, pointing to something Kevin couldn't see, and other vehicles were gathering behind the blue Kenworth, forming a convoy that stretched back beyond the mirror's range. Kevin tried covering the mirror with a towel, but he could still feel the phantom traffic behind him, and the other cars had become a constant weight in his mind, like having passengers he couldn't see, but could always feel watching him. Kevin's attention was drawn to something off to the side of the highway by the same pointing gesture, and when he looked where they were pointing, he saw a rest area that wasn't marked on any of his maps or GPS systems. The exit ramp appeared in his headlights as if it had materialized out of thin air, leading to a facility that appeared to be decades old but was in perfect condition, and the phantom cars in his mirror were all pointing for the same exit. Their turn signals blinking in unison. Kevin found himself taking the exit despite every sensible thought telling him to keep driving. The facility ahead looked like something from the 1970s, with classic architecture and signage that belonged to an earlier era of highway travel. As Kevin pulled into the rest area, he realized it was occupied by dozens of trucks and cars that matched the vehicles he'd been seeing in his mirror. The phantom traffic had become real, or maybe Kevin had crossed over into their realm. Drivers were making their way between the vehicles, all of them looking exhausted and perplexed, as if they'd been driving for decades without welcome to the way station, he said. This is where we rest between runs on the Shadow Highway. As they arrived at their destinations, the driver of the blue Kenworth pulled up to Kevin's cab. His weariness was even more noticeable up close, with deep lines around his eyes and a weariness that seemed to go beyond simple fatigue. Here, time passes differently. For 40 years, some of us have been attempting to return to the real world by driving the same routes. The blue Kenworth driver explained. The mirror chooses who can see. Kevin discovered that the rest area was located between the actual highway system and the imaginary roads that were visible in his mirror. Drivers who got caught up in the parallel network would eventually find their way here, a place where they could stop but never truly rest, always forced to return to the endless highways that led nowhere. When you see the shadow traffic, you join it. Your vehicle begins to show up in other drivers' mirrors, and ultimately you cross over entirely. Usually, it's drivers who are alone on the road, pushing too hard, and spending too much time alone. Kevin spoke with drivers who had been stuck on the phantom roadways for decades for what seemed like hours in the way station. They told him of deliveries that could never be made, of endless routes that looked familiar but actually led to places that didn't exist, and of an increasing need to locate fresh drivers who might be able to notice the shadow traffic. Upon arriving back at his truck, Kevin saw that his mirrors, all of them now, not just the replacement, displayed the actual roadway and the phantom traffic at the same time. Kevin could no longer tell the two road networks apart. They were in the same area, divided only by a barrier. Along Interstate 40, he could see regular traffic, but the never-ending procession of phantoms was superimposed on it, automobiles, on their own enigmatic routes. Although Kevin finished his delivery to Seattle, the trip took far longer than it needed to. He kept taking exits that went to truck stops and rest places that were exclusive to the network of shadow highways. He came into contact with more stranded drivers at each stop. They are all attempting to return to reality, but they are unable to get off the parallel highways. The worst thing was realizing more and more that Kevin was becoming into one of them. There were inconsistencies in his logbook that were inexplicable. Driving hours that appeared to take place outside of regular temporal flow. Miles traveled on roads not shown on official maps. Other drivers started to report seeing Kevin's truck in improbable places, traveling on roadways that were either non-existent or closed for construction. Another trucker near Spokane recorded Kevin's last CB radio transmission. Highway ghost is this. Don't trust salvage yards for replacement mirrors if you receive this. Once you see the shadow highway, it's impossible to turn back. We're all here, attempting to find our way home while traveling endlessly. A week later, Kevin's truck was discovered empty, but with the engine still running at a rest area south of Portland. According to the logbook, he had been driving non-stop for more than 200 hours, which is impossible given human endurance limits and government rules. The replacement mirror had vanished, seemingly snatched by an unidentified individual. However, on empty highways, drivers still report seeing Kevin's red Peterbilt in their mirrors, always keeping a steady distance behind them. Additionally, mirrors from damaged trucks wait for new owners in salvage yards around the nation, unaware that certain reflections reveal more than just the road behind you. They depict the roads that mirror our reality and are filled by motorists who have lost their way and are unable to find their way back. 8. The sleeper berth that never slept. After 15 years of operating corporate trucks, Eddie Vasquez was ready to become an owner-operator and purchased a second-hand Freightliner Cascadia in Dallas in the summer of 2022. Eddie couldn't resist the offer from the rig's previous owner, Carl Hutchkins, whose estate was selling it after he passed away from a heart attack while parked at a truck stop in New Mexico. Eddie was unaware that Carl had not passed away quietly while he slept. At 3 a.m, he was discovered sitting up straight in his driver's seat. His face was fixed in a look of complete dread, his eyes wide open. The truck appeared to be ideal for Eddie's requirements. The 2019 model featured a roomy sleeper berth that would be his home on long-distance journeys, a well-maintained engine, and low mileage. Everything was clean and in working order. However, the interior had typical wear from Carl's use. The sleeper berth's mattress appeared brand new, as if it had just been replaced, which was the only strange thing Eddie could find. Eddie hauled goods throughout the Southwest without any issues on his first several runs. The sleeper berth was sufficiently comfortable to allow for adequate rest during required break periods, and the vehicle operated without a hitch. But Eddie first tasted what would turn into a nightly nightmare on his 4th journey, when he was deadheading from Phoenix to pick up a cargo in El Paso. Around 1000 p.m., he had parked at a truck stop outside of Tucson, intending to sleep for 8 hours before going on to El Paso. When Eddie climbed in, closed the blinds, and went to bed, the sleeper berth felt normal. Around 2 a.m, the feeling that someone else was present throughout the berth roused him. Eddie sensed that the mattress was moving, like though someone had squeezed into the little opening. It was a modest but distinct movement. He could tell that someone was lying down next to him by the steady compression and release of springs. When Eddie made contact, his hand found nothing but empty air in the darkness. However, the feeling of an additional presence remained. Eddie initially ascribed the event to stress and the transitional phase of sleeping in a new setting. However, the same thing happened every night at roughly 2 a.m, always moving in the same way, as if they were ascending into the berth. Eddie tried sleeping in the driver's seat, turning on the lights, and even setting up his phone to film videos, but to no avail. The nightly visitation, and during the ensuing weeks, the presence increased. The vacant room next to Eddie started to radiate body heat. Additionally, he occasionally heard breathing that wasn't his, exhalations that were slow and strained, indicating respiratory difficulties. Eddie was reminded of his grandfather's last days before he passed away from lung disease by the damp, suffocating nature of the breathing. Eddie found out more about Carl Hutchkins and the history of the truck. The prior owner was a seasoned driver with more than 30 years of experience, who was renowned for his dependability and commitment to his work. However, in his latter months, other drivers had seen that Carl appeared more and more nervous and worn out, saying that even though he spent enough time in his sleeper crib, he was unable to sleep and was always tired. When Eddie started feeling what felt like physical contact from the unseen entity, things became more heated. Every morning, he would awaken to the touch of a delicate, yet definitely real hand on his arm or shoulder. It was an unusually frigid touch, and the chill it left would last 4 hours after Eddie's awakening. Then he heard murmured words in a voice he didn't recognize, and occasionally he felt breath on his neck. Eddie attempted to explain these encounters away as signs of stress-induced hallucinations or sleep deprivation. He saw a physician, had sleep tests, and even sought advice from an anxiety disorder specialist therapist. The results of every medical test were normal, and the experts explained his experiences by pointing to the psychological difficulties of acclimating to life as a self-employed truck driver. However, Eddie was aware that his experience was not psychological. There was a real presence in his sleeper berth, and it was growing more violent every night. More aggressive contact, pushing, pulling, and grasping replaced the delicate touches, leaving Eddie with bruises he couldn't understand. He occasionally woke up to discover his pillow at the bird's foot or his blankets pushed away. Eddie's decision to do further in-depth research on Carl Hutchins was the turning point. He got unsettling information about Carl's last months from other drivers who had known him. According to some truckers, Carl had developed an obsession with an unseen entity he dubbed the passenger, who he said accompanied him every night during his sleeper berth. These sources claim that Carl had made every effort to get rid of his unwanted passenger. He had replaced new bedding and interior parts, had the vehicle sanctified by many religious leaders, and had even made multiple attempts to sell the rig. However, during test drives, prospective purchasers would express discomfort and describe feeling as though something they couldn't see was watching or touching them. Eddie learned that Carl's death had been more complicated than a heart attack. Unusual circumstances were cited in the coroner's report. Although Carl had noted in the truck stop's log that he intended to sleep in his berth, he had been discovered in his driver's seat in the middle of the night. Around 2 a.m., Carl was seen on security camera footage getting out of his pickup, and making their way to the main structure. But before getting to the door, he had passed out in the parking lot. The most unsettling aspect was that Carl was involved in a conversation with an unseen partner when he collapsed. Security footage revealed Carl was all by himself in the parking lot, but several cars in the vicinity claimed to have heard his voice begging someone to let him sleep. Equipped with this knowledge, Eddie faced the entity head-on. He waited in the sleeper born for the 2 a.m. throughout his subsequent required rest period. Visitation. Eddie spoke out loud when he sensed the familiar feeling of someone climbing into the berth next to him. The reaction was swift and horrifying. "Carl, I know you're here. You need to move on. This isn't your truck anymore." Eddie could feel his breath condensing in the unexpectedly cold air as the temperature in the sleeper delivery fell. The presence grew more palpable, and Eddie sensed what appeared to be hands desperately grasping his shoulders and arms. Eddie became aware that Carl had not just perished in the vehicle when he heard a voice whispering in his ear, barely audible, but clearly real. "Can't sleep, can't rest, keep driving, have to keep driving." His soul had been imprisoned in the sleeper berth, destined to suffer from chronic insomnia and travel the ghostly highways that run parallel to the actual road system in America. Instead of being malevolent, the presence seemed anxious for the rest that death ought to have given but yet failed to bring. Following Eddie's attempt at communication, the nightly encounters became more intense. Acknowledgement seemed to strengthen Carl's spirit, and the bodily manifestations intensified. The curtains of the sleeper born would move when Eddie woke up, but there was no airflow. Items were rearranged to indicate mile markers, route numbers, and occasionally even CB radio messages from his truck's radio. The phantom radio messages were consistent even when the equipment was turned off. Carl's voice reporting his location, requesting help, and requesting directions to places that were not shown on any map. There was confusion and worrying about a driver who appeared to be lost and in difficulty, but could not be found as other truckers started to pick up these broadcasts and report them to the authorities. As the number of sleepless nights mounted, Eddie's health started to decline. His reflexes were becoming severely hampered by the excessive amounts of caffeine and stimulants he was using to keep awake while driving. He was aware that he was getting close to the same level of desperation and tiredness that had engulfed Carl, but he couldn't afford to give up the truck that stood for his financial commitment to independence. It got to the point of crisis. While running in West Texas, Eddie was starting to see and hear things while he drove, and he hadn't slept well in more than a week. Road signs indicating places that only existed in the recollections of long-dead travelers, phantom cars that matched his pace, and CB conversation from truckers who had passed away years before. Eddie made a last-ditch choice while at a required rest stop outside of Amarillo. He attempted to assist the ensnared spirit in finding tranquility other than resisting Carl's presence. He looked into Carl's last known location and found that, at the time of his death, the man was attempting to return home for his daughter's wedding. 3 years had passed since the wedding, but Carl's soul appeared to be stuck on an endless journey that would never lead him to his destination. Eddie parked his pickup outside the house where the wedding celebration had been held after driving to the town where Carl's daughter lived. He addressed Carl's attendants throughout the sleeper berth that evening. "You succeeded. The wedding is the reason you're here. It was a lovely wedding for your daughter. Now you can relax." The reaction was a feeling immense relief and thankfulness. Slowly, the icy presence that had plagued Eddie's evenings subsided, and he felt really alone in his sleeper berth for the first time in months. The temperature stabilized. At 2 a.m., the phantom breathing ceased. Visits came to an end. Eddie ran a few more times without any problems. Additionally, the vehicle operated as usual. However, he couldn't get rid of the thought of what had happened to Carl, and what might happen to any driver who was overly dependent on the road, cut off from other people, and preoccupied with the never-ending route rather than the places that make travel meaningful. Eddie sold the Freightliner and purchased a new truck 6 months later. Another owner-operator bought the Cascadia, and in his first several months of ownership, he experienced no strange incidents. However, Eddie occasionally questions whether Carl's spirit has simply moved on to other roadways, or whether it is patiently waiting for another motorist who might become so engrossed in the journey that they lose sight of their home. The trucking sector has consistently attracted individuals who feel more at ease on the roadways than in stationary places, and who are more at ease moving than sitting there. Eddie discovered, however, that some drivers get so attached to the ride that they are unable to accept its conclusion, resulting in a kind of haunting that transforms the very cars that stand for freedom into prisons of unending turmoil. The ghosts of drivers who were unable to let go continue their spectral runs in sleeper trains around America, coexisting among the living and serving as a reminder that some passengers never make it to their destination. 9. The truck stopping. His 19 years of long-distance driving, Frank DeLua had dined at every major truck stop chain from coast to coast. However, the food at the Iron Horse Diner, located off Interstate 80 in Nebraska, defies all the laws of deterioration and time. In January 2023, Frank first learned about the location, the blizzard, when he had to take the next exit before the visibility totally vanished due to whiteout conditions. The truck stop at the end of the exit ramp appeared to have been preserved. From the 1970s, the main structure was a conventional diner, complete with big windows, booths made of red vinyl, and a neon sign that flashed in the snow. Frank was instantly struck by how well kept everything looked, even though it was clearly old. The paint, despite the continuous storm, the parking area was flawlessly plowed. The chrome fixtures shone, and it wasn't faded. In order to avoid the bitter cold, Frank quickly parked his trailer among a dozen other trucks. With checkered floor tiles, a long counter with rotating stalls, and a jukebox playing vintage country music, the diner's interior complemented its throwback appearance. After driving through the storm 4 hours, Frank's mouth began to water as the warm air carried the familiar aromas of coffee, bacon, and freshly baked pie. Wearing a traditional pink uniform and a name tag that said Dolores, the waitress who came over to his booth appeared to be in her 50s. From her flawlessly combed hair to her pristine apron, she looked flawless. However, there was something about her that Frank couldn't quite place right away. Her face looked artificial when she smiled, too fixed and unwavering to be completely genuine. Dolores' voice had a faint echo when she spoke, "Welcome to the Iron Horse, honey," as though she was speaking from inside a big, empty room. "What can I get you tonight?" Frank asked, ordering coffee and the typical truck stop fare meatloaf special, which would satisfy his hunger and keep him warm for the rest of the trip. Dolores used a mechanical pen to write down his order. Accuracy, her handwriting flawless in a manner that implied deliberate practice rather than organic flow. Frank saw that her footsteps were silent on the hard tile floor as she left. Frank watched the other diners in the diner while he waited for his food. Like him, the majority were truckers who ate their lunches in silence while sitting by themselves at the counter or in booths. However, their actions were strangely coordinated. They all flipped newspaper pages at precisely the same times, chewed their food in unison, and raised their coffee cups at precisely the same intervals. He could hear the same lines being spoken in the same cadences by various people in repeating talks. The heavy ceramic mug that held Frank's coffee was nearly too hot to handle. In addition to being just the proper temperature and intensity, the coffee was somehow fresher than any coffee from a truck stop should have been. However, as Frank drank, he became aware of an unsettling aspect of the mug. Hairline cracks and stains on the ceramic indicated decades of wear. However, it appeared that the coffee's heat was coming from the mug itself, not the liquid within. With the same eerie perfection, the meatloaf special appeared. The mashed potatoes were fluffy and buttery, the vegetables were crisp, and the dish was substantial. But there was something strange about the cuisine that Frank could not quite place, as though it had been designed to evoke some romanticized recollection of comfort food rather than being prepared by human hands. It tasted almost too much like meatloaf should. Frank started to notice odd aspects about the cafe as he was eating. The wall-mounted clock read 11:47 p.m. However, even though time was clearly passing, the hands remained motionless. Each track started precisely where the one before it did, and the jukebox played the same songs in the same order. The other patrons never seemed to finish their meals, which was the most disturbing. No matter how long Frank watched them eat, their plates never got any fuller. Dolores gave Frank a handwritten bill that had yesterday's prices, but today's date on it when he asked for his check. Compared to what Frank was used to spending at truck stops, the sums were far less, representing expenses from many decades ago. Frank paid with cash, but when Dolores returned with his change, the note she gave him appeared to be incorrect. After pointing out the disparity, Dolores remarked, "Our prices never change, honey. We serve the same meals at the same cost. Every day. Every day." The paper felt older and heavier than contemporary currency, even if the denominations were exact. There was a subtle quality to the printing that suggested these bills had been issued years before their printed dates, and the serial numbers were formatted in a way that Frank was unfamiliar with. Frank opted to use the restroom before heading back to his truck. He was ready to depart. The facilities looked like original installations from decades ago, yet they were just as well maintained as the rest of the cafe. Frank's reflection was plainly visible in the mirror above the sink, which also appeared to portray the bathroom it had appeared in earlier times. Older fixtures, various tile patterns, and even what seemed to be other persons using the facilities at different times were all visible to him. When Frank returned to the main eating area, he saw that the storm outside had entirely stopped, even though the weather forecast said the blizzard would last through the evening. He could see stars and beautiful skies through the diner's windows, as like the bad weather had never happened. His truck was exactly where he had parked it, but it looked like it had just been washed, and the snow that had been building up on his windshield was disappeared. Frank got into his taxi and looked at his logbook, intending to note an hour-long rest break, but his computerized logging gadget showed that no time had elapsed, even though he clearly remembered spending a lot of time inside the diner. The system indicated that he had arrived at the truck stop and left in the same minute. His gasoline indicator showed the same reading on when he had arrived, and there had been no change in the distance on his odometer. Frank drove west on Interstate 80. Confused yet eager to make up time, he attempted to make sense of what had happened in the Iron Horse Diner, but the recollections appeared strangely hazy, like if he were trying to remember specifics of a dream that became less clear by the second. The flavor of exquisite coffee and the few strangely textured banknotes in his wallet were the only tangible signs that he had stopped. Frank made the decision to make another visit at the Iron Horse 3 weeks later while running the same route. Upon taking the same exit, he discovered that the diner had been replaced by an empty lot. There was no parking lot, no building, and no indication that there had ever been a structure there. Frank queried other vehicles about the Iron Horse. While driving 10 miles down the highway to a truck stop, no one had ever heard of it, and a number of seasoned drivers who frequently traveled I-80 stated that there had never been a truck stop that exit. When Frank looked up the place online, he found unsettling details about its past. There had once been a truck stop called the Iron Horse Diner near the exit, but it had burned down in 1987, following a kitchen fire that left 3 employees dead and numerous patrons injured. The land had been unoccupied for more than 30 years, and the business had never been rebuilt. Frank discovered a list of the fire victims, which was the most horrifying detail. One was Dolores McCarthy, a waitress who had been employed at the Iron Horse for more than 20 years and was characterized in newspaper stories as a devoted worker, even down to the pink uniform and immaculately combed hair. Her photo in the archive matched the one who had brought Frank his dinner. Frank discovered internet discussion boards where other truckers had similar stories to tell. Numerous motorists reported pulling over at food and services from earlier decades were offered in truck stops, diners, and rest areas that appeared to exist in temporal bubbles. The same things happened every time: great meal, flawless service, old-fashioned prices, and the slow awareness that none of it should have been possible. The reports from drivers who have eaten at these transitory eateries more than once were the most unsettling. They spoke of an increasing urge to go back even though they knew the locations shouldn't be there. According to some, the food from these phantom restaurants never fulfilled their hunger completely, leaving them with a need that could only be satiated by going back to the same places that were impossible. Frank started to steer clear of that section of Interstate 80. However, he couldn't help but think about the Iron Horse Diner. He had a craving that ordinary truck stop food couldn't satiate because of the recollection of that ideal coffee and meatloaf. To justify stopping at the exit, he began to take longer routes. However, each time he merely discovered the vacant land. Frank saw the Iron Horse again 6 months after his first meeting. It looked just like it had, the same neon sign that flickered, the same architecture from the 1970s, the same warm welcome that spilled out of the windows into the night. Frank saw additional features this time that he had overlooked on his initial visit. The trucks in the parking lot all looked like well-maintained models from earlier decades, but they were obviously from different periods of trucking history. Dolores welcomed Frank with the same unwavering smile as he walked into the diner. "Welcome back, honey," She greeted him, as though he had just returned. "The table you usually use is ready." Frank became increasingly horrified upon realizing that his table was ordinary. Even though he had only dined there once, Dolores guided him to a particular booth that seemed familiar in a way that defied accommodation. She gave him the same menu he had seen on his first visit, with the same faded photos of cuisine that seemed too good to be true in yellowed pages. Frank realized that he was joining the Iron Horse Diner's temporal loop as he sat there among patrons who never grew older and employees who never changed. He would become one of the synchronized patrons who ate the same dishes in the same rhythm, stuck in a moment that would never move on, as each visit pulled him farther into the diner's pocket of frozen time. Drivers who are craving more than simply meals still see the Iron Horse Diner. Those who yearn for the ease and coziness of a bygone period. At that time, truck stops served as meeting spots for a group of drivers who watched out for one another. However, some comfort food has a cost that isn't mentioned on any menu. Additionally, some dishes are so flawless that they can never really be completed, causing a hunger that can only be sated by going back to locations that don't normally exist in time. The engine that remembered every mile in his garage outside of Memphis, Bobby Hartwell rebuilt the Caterpillar C-15 engine himself, using parts salvaged from 3 separate trucks that had been damaged in separate interstate incidents. Bobby took delight in reviving damaged equipment as an owner-operator and trained diesel mechanic. However, it turned out that the engine he put together using those salvaged parts could recall more than just the mechanical details of its earlier iterations. Bobby had put in 6 months of painstaking labor to repair. The engine block was from a Peterbilt that had instantaneously killed the driver when it jackknifed during a Montana ice storm. When the driver of a Kenworth fell asleep at the wheel and the vehicle rear-ended a concrete barrier in Texas, the transmission was saved. The wiring harness and ECM were taken from a Freightliner that had been discovered abandoned on a highway in Nevada. Despite numerous efforts, its driver was never found. After installing the repaired engine in his 2015 Volvo, Bobby was pleased with how well it performed in the first few test drives. Fuel and power delivery were both seamless. The engine operated with the quiet assurance of a well-balanced machine and efficiency beyond expectations. However, Bobby started experiencing things that couldn't be explained by mechanics during his first long-haul drive with the restored power plant during a regular night run to Dallas. The first anomaly happened somewhere near Little Rock, Arkansas. Bobby was traveling at a constant 65 miles per hour when the engine abruptly started to run rough, as though it were having trouble pushing a big load uphill. The highway, however, was level. Every gauge displayed normal readings, and Bobby's trailer was almost completely empty. Before the engine resumed its smooth running, the rough running lasted precisely 3 minutes. Bobby completed a thorough diagnostic check to pulling into the next truck stop. He discovered no mechanical cause for the brief power outage, and all systems tested normally. Bobby, however, found something unsettling when he went through his electronic locks, the precise area where the Montana Peterbilt had jackknifed 2 years prior matched the GPS locations where the rough running had taken place. The 3 minutes matched exactly how long the initial motorist had been trying to restore control before to the deadly collision. In the weeks that followed, the engine started to show comparable incidents at particular places throughout Bobby's usual routes. The transmission would forcefully downshift and the engine would abruptly idle high around Amarillo, Texas, as if the truck was struggling with phantom braking. It was the same spot where the Kenworth had collided with the concrete wall. On a lonely highway in Nevada, the engine would shut off all power for precisely 47 seconds. Investigators calculated how long the abandoned Freightliner had been in operation before its driver disappeared. Bobby conducted more in-depth study on the 3 source vehicles' histories and discovered unsettling trends. In addition to their final collisions, All three trucks had been involved in mysterious incidents, drivers who had previously driven prior to their crashes. These rigs reported electrical systems that activated controls no human hand had touched, transmissions that shifted in response to non-existent road conditions, engines that appeared to respond to invisible inputs, and mechanical behaviors that didn't match any known failure modes. Just hours before the deadly jackknife, Russell Kane, the veteran driver of the Montana Peterbilt, had called his dispatcher to report that his truck was driving itself and memorizing roads it had never been on. Maria Santos, the driver of the Texas Kenworth, had complained on several occasions about her engine struggling to keep up with her and accelerating and decelerating without her using the throttle pedal. James Park, the missing driver of the Nevada Freightliner, had posted on trucker sites about his engine making decisions that appeared to originate elsewhere. Bobby started to realize that the mechanical parts of the rebuilt engine had more than simply their original specifications left as he kept running loads with it. Every mile they had driven with their former operators was imprinted with their recollections and driving habits. The engine produced power in addition to burning fuel. The experiences of drivers who were no longer able to operate their trucks were reenacted when Bobby discovered that the engine was also learning from him. The psychological effect grew stronger. On well-known routes, the engine would predict his driving choices, reducing idle speed before rest stops he hadn't chosen yet, and downshifting before hills he hadn't yet climbed. The truck was forming a collective driving awareness that fused the ghostly patterns of its departed former operators with Bobby's tendencies. When the engine started to override Bobby's control inputs, things got dicey. Bobby tried to slow down for construction while running across Colorado, but his throttle pedal was uncooperative, as though recalling the recollections of drivers who had driven that route before to construction. The engine continued to run at highway speed through the work zone. Bobby needed to use his emergency brake to prevent cars in front of him from rear-ending. The moments when the engine appeared to be fueled by the experiences of drivers who had suffered horrific deaths were even more horrifying. The engine would struggle against steering inputs during thunderstorms, exhibiting the same unpredictable behavior Russell Kane had previously detailed prior to his deadly jackknife. This dangerous instability was what caused the Montana disaster. The engine would reenact Maria Santos's last moments in heavy traffic, rushing forward uncontrolled, as though attempting to finish the rear-end crash that had claimed her life. Bobby attempted to replace electronic parts and reprogram the ECM, but the ghost driving behaviors continued. Through a method that went beyond typical mechanical operation, the engine's memory appeared to be stored at a deeper level than its computer systems, incorporated in the metal itself. The echo of earlier combustions was carried by each piston stroke. The shifting patterns of drivers who were no longer there were replicated with each gear engagement. A nighttime dash across Nevada on the same roadway where James Park had disappeared was the tipping moment. This time, however, Bobby experienced the old feeling of the engine starting to take over his control. The engine started to run based on cues from someone outside the cab rather than mechanical issues. Under Bobby's hands, the steering wheel twisted on a path that veered off the designated roadway and onto unmarked roads in the desert. Although Bobby resisted the steering, the engine's power steering system was acting against him by using GPS coordinates that no navigation system had been set to follow. Following what appeared to be James Park's last known path before going missing, the truck continued its journey deeper into the Nevada desert. Over his CB radio, Bobby could hear voices, not live broadcasts, but recordings of Park's last conversations describing his incapacity to operate his car and his perplexity about where he was. Bobby discovered the strewn about remnants of the old Freightliner when the engine finally stopped in a remote location. Scavengers have plundered the truck during the two, even though it had been years since Park vanished. There was still enough wreckage to prove that this was the location where the missing driver had stopped. Bobby's rebuilt engine had navigated back to the location where one of its component systems had last operated by using its collective memory. Bobby discovered James Park's logbook among the rubble. It was still readable despite the bleached pages from exposure. The identical